Hi, this is Vivian Vande Velde. I want to welcome you to Chapter 3 of Ghost of a Hanged Man. A very spooky story to keep you occupied during these days of coronavirus and to maybe help you not feel quite so alone. Okay, Chapter 3 out of 15 chapters. I will be reading every day um, in a row. Chapter 3 is called Tinkers, and the date is set as spring 1878. According to the calendar, it was spring, but the first time I saw any of the Tinkers up close, the day was as cold and gray as winter. There was still another hour of school, but Miss Hawks had sent me on an errand to Pickett's general store. Charity Pickett, perhaps the most badly misnamed girl in the whole town, with the possible exception of her older sister, Patience, had gotten sick. Charity said it was from Billy Empey tugging on her braids all morning and giving her a headache, and that Billy should be expelled because of it. I was inclined to believe it was more probably due to the fact that, as usual, Charity gulped her lunch down real fast before anybody could ask her to share or trade, and then she'd spent just about the entire recess time spinning around, pretending to be a top, and crashing into people. Whatever the cause, that afternoon Charity threw up all over her desk, herself, and Billy Empey's shoes. Then, after Miss Hawks finished cleaning up the mess and asked Charity if she was feeling better now, Charity merely held her stomach and swayed greenly in her seat. So that was how Miss Hawks came to tell me to go find Mrs. Pickett or Patience, who was 16 and no longer attended school, and tell one or the other of them to kindly come fetch Charity before she was sick again. And that was how I happened to walk in Pickett's general store and find myself in the middle of an uproar. Mrs. Pickett was hollering. My pa was there. A crowd was gathering, and the center of the problem seemed to be a pair of strangers I'd never seen before, a young man 5 or 6 years older than me, and a woman who, by the way she was defending him, had to be the young man's mother. She and Mrs. Pickett were going at each other, looking ready to come to blows. Mrs. Pickett calling the woman a thief and a mother of thieves, and a woman calling Mrs. Pickett a pig-faced witch. You're the witch, Mrs. Pickett said. Dirty gypsy witch. I sidled up to Patience and asked, "What's going on?" Tinkers, Patience told me, with a sneer for my stupidity. Gypsies. I had guessed that already, by the stranger woman's flounced and brightly colored skirts. I knew a group of Tinkers were camped north of the town on the river, 7 or 8 wagons that had been there all winter, which was longer than Tinkers usually stay, but I hadn't been close up to any of them before. My father was trying to calm the situation down. I could tell even though I couldn't hear what he was saying over the two women yelling at each other. I was about to ask Patience for more details when Pa finally raised his voice to be heard above all the racket. "Quiet!" he demanded. "I said one at a time. Mrs. Pickett?" The tinker woman snorted and tossed her hair, which was all loose like a girl's. Her expression clearly stated she had suspected all along she wouldn't really get a chance to tell her side of it. Patience leaned in to me and said, "Tinkers are good for raising good horses and for fixing things and sharpening scissors and knives and such. But everybody knows they're thieves. That's why they never stay long in any one place. Honest folk won't have them." I hadn't noticed there were any other tinkers in the room until someone beside me snorted, just like the tinker woman had done. It was a girl who looked younger than me, but older than Annabel, and she was dressed in similar fashion to the woman Mrs. Pickett was even now scolding for having raised thieves. I felt bad about what Patience had said, since my asking was what had caused her to say it. "Don't pay attention to Patience," I told the girl. "She hates everybody." "Starting with you, Benjamin Springer," Patience snarled and stalked away from me. The tinker girl didn't look impressed that I had defended her. "Your mother and brother?" I asked. The girl looked at me as though my brains were dribbling out my nose. "Uncle and great aunt," she said, and turned her back on me to see what was going on with her kinfolk. Just as I had lost patience, capital P, so Pa was losing patience, small p, also. He told Mrs. Pickett, "Why don't you just tell me what happened? That gypsy boy," Mrs. Pickett pointed at the young man, "come in here, touching everything, looking at everything, trying to decide what all to steal." "Mrs. Pickett," Pa said in his warning voice, "was anything stolen?" Mrs. Pickett ignored that question. "And he knocked over that glass and broke it." The other woman said, "He didn't break your glass. Why would he want to touch it? It's so ugly. He was standing right by me over here when it fell." She had an accent that gave her voice a nice sing-song quality, despite the fact that she was shouting. "He fooled with it before," Mrs. Pickett said, "so that it fell over later." The tinker woman said something in her own language and made a gesture that I didn't recognize, but I reckoned most probably it wasn't polite. I doubt Mrs. Pickett knew what it meant either, but she must have figured W back, for she repeated the motion twice, bigger and angrier. Pa stepped between them, with his arms outstretched to keep them from going at each other. "That's enough," he warned. He turned to Mr. Pickett and asked, "Jeremiah, what did you see?" Mr. Pickett drew the word out, not liking to contradict Mrs. Pickett. Nobody liked to contradict Mrs. Pickett. "Didn't see anything," he admitted. Mrs. Pickett let her breath out in a puff of disgust. "This woman here," Mr. Pickett indicated the tinker woman, "was telling my fortune." "Heathen foolishness," Mrs. Pickett interrupted, "and a waste of good money." Behind Pa's back, the tinker woman repeated her earlier gesture, and Mrs. Pickett again returned it 2 times. "Be that as it may," Mr. Pickett said, "that was what she was doing, and when I heard the crash, I looked up quick, and the boy was standing by us, nowhere near the shelf." Mrs. Pickett put her back to all of us, her foot tapping in frustration. "Seems to me," Pa said, "occasional breakage is one of the risks store owners take. You can't be accusing people of breaking things and stealing things just because there's nobody else to blame." "Thank you, Pastor Springer," Mrs. Pickett muttered. Pa just said, "Show's over. Customers stay. Everybody else out." The tinker woman didn't look pleased, even though it seemed to me Pa had taken her side. She and her son left in a huff. "You too," Mrs. Pickett said to the little girl by me, "even though you've probably got half my inventory stuffed under that shawl of yours." The girl held her arms out to indicate the woman. I'm sorry, let me start that over again. The girl held her arms out to indicate she wasn't holding anything. Mrs. Pickett just said, pointing, "Out." And the girl, looking in a snit, left, pausing only to curl her lip at me. As the people who'd come to see what the ruckus was As the people who'd come to see what the ruckus was began to clear out, I heard someone ask Mr. Pickett, "So, what did she say was in your future?" The idea of anyone being able to see what the future holds never struck me as likely, so I was heading for Mrs. Pickett to tell her about charity, but I heard Mr. Pickett say, "Oh, it didn't make an awful lot of sense. Something about the town being in danger from the water." "Town usually doesn't have enough water," someone commented, as Mr. Pickett continued, "and drowning people or drowned people coming up out of the water, and people in boxes." "Oh, people in boxes," someone laughed. "Newest thing from Philadelphia, I hear. Did you and Mrs. Pickett order some?" I laughed, even knowing I had Mrs. Pickett to face yet, because it struck me as funny at the time. Tune in tomorrow for Chapter 4, and meanwhile, stay safe and healthy and be kind to one another.